Where you didn't even do a search.
morning, everyone. I just want to ask everybody to take their seats or to take their standing room. We know it's a crowded area. We will start the presentations in 5 minutes. Slowly quieting down. Good morning, everyone. This is just a reminder that we're starting in 5 minutes. Thank you so much.
We all had bottles. We get up with this
Yes. Good morning again to everyone. If everyone can either find their seat or their standing room, we know we're in a little bit of tighter quarters this year, but as someone mentioned, we're on a higher floor and higher to the heavens, closer to God, and I appreciate that enthusiasm. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, friends, and colleagues, welcome. It is a privilege to once again gather with you here at the United Nations Church Center for the annual launch of the Pope Francis Poverty Report. My name is Brianna Fitzpatrick Pelusiak. The Pelusiak is new, so I'm realizing it's very long every time I say it. And I serve as the liaison to the United Nations for Caritas Internationalis, the global confederation of over 160 Catholic humanitarian and development organizations serving people in need in more than 200 countries and territories. Each year, this specific gathering invites us to return to the moral clarity of Pope Francis's historic 2015 address to the United Nations. In that speech, Pope Francis issued a challenge that remains as urgent today as it was a decade ago: to ensure that the international community places human dignity, especially the dignity of people living in poverty, at the very center of our decisions, our policies, and our priorities. Pope Francis called on us to confront the structural causes of poverty and to recognize that the lives behind the statistics are our very brothers and sisters. The Pope Francis Poverty Report carries that spirit forward. We are deeply grateful to Fordham University's graduate program in International Political Economy and Develop, or IPED, for producing this rigorous and thoughtful annual analysis. It bridges the space between research and moral responsibility, grounding global decisions and global debates in real experiences of families and communities facing the daily realities of exclusion, climate shocks, conflict, and economic upheaval. I would also like to recognize the participation of Catholic Relief Services, one of Caritas Internationalis' 2 US-based member organizations. For many years, CRS has enriched this event by bringing not only its global expertise, but also an actionable advocacy ask that invites all of us to translate reflection into impact. We are especially glad to welcome the CRS University student chapters here today. Your commitment to global solidarity and your willingness to accompany communities facing poverty and displacement give us all tremendous hope for the future of humanitarian leadership. Today's gathering reminds us why spaces like the United Nations Church Center matter. Just across the street, member states and UN agencies are debating what the next chapters of global cooperation and governance should look like. From financing for development to climate adaptation, food security, and peace building. Our task is to ensure that the voices and aspirations of those most affected by poverty remain at the heart of those deliberations. Thank you again for being here, for your commitment, and for joining this conversation. It's my honor now to introduce Monsignor Marco Formica, a counselor at the Permanent Observer Mission of the Holy See to the United Nations. Before we hear greetings from the Holy See mission here, I would like to let you know that Monsignor Formica was ordained a Catholic priest in 2003 in Italy, and he holds a doctorate in dogmatic theology. So very smart. After completing his studies in diplomacy and international law at the Pontifical Ecclesiastical Academy, he joined the Holy See's diplomatic service, where he was appointed to the Apostolic Nunciatures in Zambia, also accredited to Malawi, the Apostolic Nunciature in Israel, also accredited to Cyprus, and delegations in Jerusalem and Palestine. And most recently, before joining the mission here, was stationed at the Section for Relations with States and International Organizations of the Secretariat of State of the Holy See, placed in Vatican City. Thank you so much for being here and for bringing greetings from the mission.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rhea. See, going around the world at a certain point, using the glasses, unfortunately. Esteemed professors and students, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it's indeed an honor and a privilege to be here representing the Holy See at the presentation of this year's report. And I would like to extend the cordial greetings of His Excellency Archbishop Caccia, the permanent observer of the Holy See to the United Nations. Before I begin, I would like to first thank Dr. Henry, and indeed for his kind invitation, and the staff and the students of Fordham University for their invaluable efforts in producing this annual report. It is customary for the report to be presented on the World Day of the Poor. And this year, however, the event assumes particular significance. First, because the World Day of the Poor is being celebrated in the context of the 2025's Jubilee year, entitled Pilgrims of Hope. And second, it occurred in a year where we lost our Holy Father, Pope Francis, who instituted this day. The profound affection and esteem in which Pope Francis is held by Catholics and others is so great that it cannot be sufficiently expressed in words. Furthermore, it would be difficult for me to summarize the significant attention he has devoted to helping the poor in his teachings and in his personal life. However, in my humble opinion, both intentions have been met today by the report. The fact that university students and their tutors are committed to monitoring global poverty, including its spiritual dimension, is compelling evidence of Pope Francis' extraordinary and irreversible impact on the present and future life of the Church. Despite this great loss, in a swift moment of divine providence, the Church received the gift of the new successor of St. Peter in the person of Pope Leo XIV. In continuity with Pope Francis, Pope Leo XIV urges us not to neglect this commitment to the poor, but to embrace it in our lives. Indeed, authentic Christianity is deeply linked to a profound commitment to addressing poverty. He said, the poor put us in contact with the truth of the gospel. Thus far, Pope Leo gifted the Church with two documents about poverty, which I think are of great importance for today's meeting. The message for the World Day of the Poor, and then the Apostolic Exhortation Dilexite, published recently, almost 1 month ago, more than 1 month ago. In his message for the World Day, entitled You Are My Hope, Pope Leo emphasizes that the root causes of poverty are both spiritual and structural, and he calls for a comprehensive international response to alleviate it. Drawing from biblical teachings, he highlights that true hope for the poor is found in God, not in material wealth. Poverty, he argues, is not merely an absence of goods, but the result of a spiritual neglect and systematic injustice. The Pope calls on international community to confront the structural causes of poverty, which are often rooted in inequality, conflicts, and social neglect. He insists that the poverty is not merely a matter of solidarity, but a question of justice and mercy. The international community must work to create policies that promote equality in access to basic needs like labor, education, housing, and healthcare. He further reminds us in this document that the greatest form of poverty is not to know God, which can leave individuals spiritually needy, unable to find lasting peace or fulfillment. This spiritual neglect of divine worsens our spiritual condition and physical conditions, as material wealth in itself, with its relief from physical suffering, cannot provide the lasting interior fulfillment, which is the deepest yearning of the human heart. And in the Lexicte, Pope Leo repeats a profound appeal to the nations to confront and eradicate poverty in all its forms. He insists that the condition of the poor is a cry that constantly challenges our lives, societies, political and economic systems, and the Church itself. While efforts to eliminate poverty have grown, Pope Leo acknowledges that our commitment remains insufficient, because modern societies are often perpetuate inequality and favor systems that benefit the powerful. And he welcomes the UN goals to end poverty, affirming it is to be welcomed that the United Nations has made the eradication of poverty one of its goals of the millennium. Human poverty, he explains, is multifaceted: material, social, moral, cultural, and spiritual. Its many phases reveal the suffering of Christ himself. Yet he warns that new, subtler forms of poverty have emerged, driven by consumerism, inequality, and indifference. A world that reverences wealth and success, he cautions, creates a culture of discard that tolerates suffering and forgets the poor, who is our neighbor. He draws attention to worsening conditions across the globe, noting that even in wealthy countries, more and more families find themselves unable to make it to the end of the month. He highlights that particularly vulnerable are the women who are doubly poor, enduring exclusion, mistreatment, and violence, despite possessing equal dignity and rights. Furthermore, he expressed concern about the dire circumstances faced by many due to a lack of food and water. In his text, he also addressed via the entire chapter the commitment of the Church to education, concluding that for the Christian faith, the education of the poor is not a favor, but a duty. Also, he stated that the most important way to help the disadvantaged is to assist them in finding a good job, in a way that can have a more dignified life by developing their abilities and contributing to their fair share. Pope Leo XIII, rejecting ideological prejudice, critiques economic systems that equate growth with progress. He also emphasizes that it cannot be said that the majority of the poor are in that position because they do not deserve otherwise, as maintained by that specious view of meritocracy that sees only the successful as deserving, and I'm quoting. He warns us not to comply with secular ideologies or political and economic approaches that lead to gross generalizations and mistaken conclusions. And again, he concludes his remarks by acknowledging the unfortunate fact that some dismiss or ridicule charitable works as if they were an obsession on the part of the few and not the burning heart of the church's mission. And he said, and this convinces me of the need to go back and reread the gospel, lest we risk replacing it with the wisdom of this world. As you may know, the Holy See is firmly convinced that inclusive, principled, and just multilateralism is the most effective way to address all the issues raised and promote genuine integral human development. The time to act is now, not as isolated entities, but as one human family. And permit me to conclude by saying, it is fitting that the World Day of the Poor is celebrated towards the end of this year of grace. Once the holy door is closed, we must cherish and share the divine gifts granted to us throughout this year of prayer, conversion, and witness. And be always ready to be witness of the hope of the gospel, namely that God became poor so that we would become rich. Let us imitate him in his humility and love one another as he has loved us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those remarks and greetings from the Holy See mission. Where's Henry? Oh, you're right there. Sorry. We now will hear the actual trends in global poverty from Henry Schwalbenberg, Miss Adriana Curto, and Miss Vivian Hirgua. Yes, I said it correctly. This year, Fordham University's Pope Francis Poverty Report, available to all of you beginning today, will be presented now. And as I said, Dr. Henry Schwalbenberg is the current director of IPED. I can't say it every time. At Fordham University, editor of the Pope Francis Global Poverty Report, and a faculty member of Fordham's Economics Department. He holds a PhD in economics from Columbia University and has traveled widely in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, working extensively in Micronesia, the Philippines, and in Southern Africa. Henry, though too humble to mention this himself, has won awards and grants from the U.S. Fulbright Program, the Mellon Foundation, the Sloan Foundation, and the U.S. Office of Technology Assessment, to name a few. Miss Adriana hails from New York and is a graduate of Syracuse University. She has served as a U.S. Peace Corps volunteer in Morocco and worked with Free Run in Afghanistan and the Arab American Family Center in Brooklyn. Currently, she is a Coverdell Fellow in Fordham's graduate IPED program and is interning with the policy team of the Bronx Borough President. This past summer, Adriana worked in Istanbul with the United Nations Development Program. Vivian is from Rwanda and is a graduate of the University of Rwanda. She has worked with the Kigali Genocide Trust and then the Permanent Mission of Rwanda to the United Nations. Currently, she is a Ricci Fellow in Fordham's graduate IPED program and is also interning with UN Women. These incredible students and professor will now present this year's report.
Hello, my name is Henry Schwalbenberg. I'm a professor, as you already know, I'm a professor of economics at Fordham. I'm the editor of this report, and I think that's enough of that. Now you already know Adriana, one of our research associates, and you already know about Vivian, our other research associates, and plus a number of students who may or may not be in this room, who also helped out with the report, and hopefully will help out with answering any difficult questions we get. Now I need to thank Brianna for the wonderful introduction. And a special thank you for Caritas Internationalis and Catholic Relief Services for co-sponsoring this UN site event to commemorate this year's World Day of the Poor. And then finally, I need to thank Monsignor Formica for representing the Holy See to the UN and being here for this event. And at this time, I'm going to ask Dr. Donna Odra, who's over there, who is our associate editor, to present Monsignor with a copy of the report so he can share it with Pope Leo. Okay, let us now begin our presentation. Main result of this year's report is that the initial recovery that we observed following the pandemic back in 2023 in reducing what we call the global poverty gap has stalled or stagnated for the past 2 years. With respect to basic material needs and fundamental civil liberties in 2025, we found some slight improvements in the poor's literacy rates, access to drinking water, and the above subsistence level employment. Unfortunately, we observed no progress in the poor's access to adequate housing and gender equity. And on the alarming side, we found a continued deterioration in the poor's access to food and religious freedoms.
Our measure of extreme poverty is based on the concept of integral human development, as drawn from the writings of Pope Paul VI and his friend, the philosopher Jacques Maritain, one of the architects of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Integral human development argues that to live a full, integrated, and dignified life, humans need both a range of material goods and spiritual freedoms. Based on this concept, Pope Francis, when he visited the United Nations in 2015, suggested that in order to understand extreme global poverty, we needed to track 7 very important indicators. 4 of these indicators are access to very basic material goods that we need in order to survive: water, food, housing, and employment. The remaining 3 of these indicators are critical spiritual freedoms, or non-tangible goods, that we need in order to guide our own lives: education, civil liberties, and religious freedom.
Following the Pope's suggestions, we have developed FODAM's Pope Francis Global Poverty Index, which has proven to be a unique measure of human well-being because of its focus on both extreme material poverty and the lack of critical spiritual freedoms. This morning, we will review the 7 different components of the FODAM Francis Index and then conclude with the determination. Sorry. This morning, as I was saying, we will review the 7 different components of the FODAM Francis Index and then conclude with the determination of our global poverty gap in 2025. Adriana will now begin our review of the different components of the index by looking at what might be the most fundamental physical human need we have: access to drinking water.
From the Joint Monitoring Program of the World Health Organization and UNICEF, we obtained data on the percentage of a nation's population that lacks access to drinking water from an improved source, such as a well, within a 30-minute period. Looking at the graph projected behind me, you can see that the number of people lacking access to drinking water has consistently declined from 2013 to 2022. Still, based on the most recently available data About 8.8% of the world's population still, or roughly 707 million people, lack basic access to water. Vivian will now look at the other fundamental physical need we track in the Fordham-Frances Index, access to food.
The UN Food and Agriculture Organization produces data on the percentage of a country's population who are continuously unable to consume enough food to meet their dietary energy requirements. As you can see on the graph, since 2017, the number of people suffering from undernourishment began to constantly increase. Due to conflict and climate change, many expected this trend to continue to worsen in the future. On the positive side, the deterioration in access to food appears to have slowed in 2022. For the most recent year of data, about 9% of the world's population lack basic access to food. This means that about 730 million people technology issues. For the most recent year of data, about 9% of the world's population, this is about 730 million, are consistently undernourished. Since the human person, should I go?
We may have to go no mic.
Since the human person is also a social being, we have social needs in addition to our physical needs. Adriana will now describe one of the most foundational social goods. Just speak louder.
Yeah, I'll speak loud. We got this.
I'll try my best. I was saying that since the human person is also a social being, we have social needs in addition to our physical needs. Adriana is going to describe now one of the most foundational social goods needed to sustain families: access to adequate housing.
So we obtained data on inadequate housing from the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative. Housing is defined as inadequate if flooring is made from dirt, mud, or dung, or if walls and roofs are missing, or if those walls and roofs are created with discarded materials such as plastic or cardboard. Due to possible measurement errors, as well as a change in the definition of inadequate housing, we're hesitant to comment on this trend. Nonetheless, according to the most recently available data, over 16% of the world's population, or more than 1 billion people, live in inadequate housing. Vivian will now look at employment, perhaps one of the most foundational social goods needed to sustain communities.
Using the data from the International Labour Organization, we calculated the distressed labor rate. The distressed labor rate includes the percentage of labor force that is either unemployed or employed, earning less than $3.20 a day. The International Labour Organization argues that without outside assistance, the lives of workers earning less than $3.20 a day are at risk. In the graph before you, you can see that since 2013, the situation has continuously improved until the outbreak of the pandemic in 2020. We have recovered from the COVID shock, but since 2023, continuous progress has slowed. As of last year, in 2024, about 21.4% of the world's labor force, just over 800 million people, were unable to meet their basic livelihood needs through employment. Dr. S will now summarize our material welfare indicators.
Looking at the maps being displayed, please note that the dark areas which show where the lack of access to basic material needs are the most extreme are highly concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as in a few other countries such as Afghanistan, Haiti, and Venezuela. Our key takeaways regarding material needs is that the data shows some limited improvements in the poor's access to drinking water and adequately remunerated employment, but no improvement in the poor's access to adequate housing and a continued decline in the poor's access to food, leading to higher levels of malnourishment. In addition to material needs, Fordham's Pope Francis Global Poverty Report is equally concerned about spiritual freedoms. In the Catholic classical tradition, the human spirit is critical and consists of the intellect, the will, and the conscience. Adriana will now begin our review of spiritual freedoms with respect to the intellect by looking at basic education and in particular literacy rates, a skill needed to empower the poor to know and understand their own situations.
So from UNESCO, we obtained data on the adult illiteracy rate. The adult illiteracy rate is defined as the percentage of a nation's population above the age of 15 who cannot read, write, or comprehend, thank you, a simple statement about their ordinary life. Looking at the graph before you, you can see that for the most part, from 2013 to 2023, the global illiteracy rate has declined. Yet for the most recently available data in 2023, slightly more than 12% of the world's population, or 767 million people, are illiterate. Vivian will now continue our review of human freedoms with respect to free will. Without civil liberties, the poor's desire and will to choose what is good for themselves and their loved ones will be frustrated. The civil liberty we're focusing on is gender equality, which can be defined as affecting up to half of the world's population. In particular, we track severe discrimination against women and girls that jeopardizes their health and survival rates.
Our gender equity comes from the World Economic Forum and the Health and Survival Index. The Health and Survival Index measures the gap between the expected healthy lifespan of females versus males, as well as the sex ratio at birth to capture the phenomenon of missing women. As shown in the graph, there was an initial reduction in the gender gap in 2014. But since that time, the health and survival situation of women relative to men has deteriorated, and especially so in 2021. From 2021 until 2023, it has remained at this high level. We estimate that roughly half of the world's female population, about 2 million people, live in countries where the risk to their health and survival is severe. Adriana will now complete our review of human freedoms with respect to the freedom of conscience by looking at the last spiritual freedom suggested by Pope Francis. Religious freedom is a right championed by both the Second Vatican Council and the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Religious freedom should help us to form a conscience that can perceive what is right and empower us to do so.
Our data from religious freedom comes from the Pew Research Center and their Government Restrictions Index. The Government Restrictions Index is a compilation of 20 measures of restrictions of religion, such as bans on particular faiths or preferential treatment to one or more religious groups. Viewing the graph before us, you can see that starting in 2017, the world experienced a significant increase in religious restrictions. And since 2017 to 2022, it has continuously slowly worsened. We estimate that more than half of the world's population, which is about 4.5 billion people, live in countries where religious freedom is highly restricted. Vivian will now summarize our spiritual freedom indicators.
Looking at the maps, you can also see that the dark areas where it shows the lack of spiritual freedoms are most extreme. Our key takeaways are that progress is mixed, some reduction in illiteracy, no change in gender equity, and increasing restrictions on religious freedom. You can also see that the dark areas are highly concentrated in Asia and North Africa. Dr. S will now conclude our presentation.
Excuse me. In the Fordham Francis Index, we measured 7 dimensions of human well-being needed to defend the dignity of the poor and empower them to transform their lives and communities. 4 are some of the most basic needs that people require in order to just survive. And 3 are some of the most critical spiritual freedoms needed to empower the poor to be able to transform their own lives and contribute to the common good. Based on the most recently available data, we found that serious gaps in all 7 dimensions. They range from a low of roughly 9% to a high of 59% of the world's population. The average of all 7 gaps is the global poverty score. Based on the latest available data, the global poverty score is currently 25.5%, which is the same as last year's poverty score and the year before that. As you can see on the graph, the global pandemic is associated with a rise in the global poverty gap, say around 2020, followed by a partial recovery to 2023, and then no progress for the last 2 years. While we have observed some improvement in the poor's access to water, literacy, and employment, we saw no improvement in their access to housing and gender equity recently. And of most concern, we continue to observe deterioration in the poor's access to food and the further erosion of religious freedoms. By our measures, the poor continue to be worse off after the pandemic than what they were prior to the pandemic. Mr. Sean Callahan, the president of Catholic Relief Services and our keynote speaker, will later this morning address the crisis in international aid and what we need to do to mobilize the resources needed to improve the global poverty score, but more importantly, empower the poor and transform their lives so they can contribute more to our society.
Thank you all for your kind attention and patience with the tech issues. You can request a copy of this written presentation by emailing us at iped@fordham.edu. There's also a recording going up on iPed's YouTube channel, which you can share, tag iPed in. And we've concluded our presentation. At this time, we'll take your questions and critiques. Thank you so much.
You want to manage the questions?
Just to note that we have 2 or 3 ushers that will take your questions. Please do speak into the microphone. That way we can catch it on the recording online. And we also have cards in case you're not comfortable sharing your question out loud or a little bit camera shy. You're more than welcome to write down your question and I can read it off for you.
Terrific.
How bad or good do you think our poverty index will be affected in the next 2 to 3 years? Which index do you think will be highly affected?
She's one of my former students. I used to ask her a whole lot of tough questions. Now they get to take their revenge. So first thing to note is that our indicator is a lagging indicator because it takes a couple of years for people to gather the data and report it and for us to analyze it. So I don't expect the bad news of the lack of mobilization of resources to fight poverty to really kick in this data for another year or 2. Usually data trails by 2 years. So I think what we're following here are some fundamental problems that are really causing the problem. So you saw that COVID made things worse, but then we only got a partial recovery. And so I'm guessing stagnation for a while. And then if this lack of emphasis on trying to deal with the problems of global poverty, that will kick in next. And so but that may take a year or 2 or 3 years to show up in our data.
Thank you for this excellent report.
And our great microphones.
It seems that there's a trend against foreign aid and aid in general from OECD countries to countries in need. A, is that sense merited? Do you see it in the data? B, how do you expect that to influence your report in coming years?
Yeah, so you're the person who will answer that question more thoroughly is Mr. Callahan, who's the president of Catholic Relief Services, because he's dealing with that on a very daily, personal, operational level. But if I remember right, it's a 40% reduction in US aid. So you can just imagine what 40%, losing 40% of your financial resources can do to any organization. So I would say that 40% means that you will survive, but you will be damaged. And then I was at a nice little meeting in Iowa, the World Food Prize, where people are very concerned mostly on the malnourishment thing. And their opinion, and this was a former administrator under the Reagan administration of USAID, and a former ambassador, the ambassador for food security under the Biden administration, so bipartisan, and also a former secretary of agriculture. Their opinion was that we will eventually learn the damage that we are causing, and then we'll have to react to that. And what they're trying to do is create study groups so that we can not forget how we react to these crises. So when they overwhelm us again, we're able to respond. But at this point, we have, I probably should leave it to you to say that the extent of the devastation that the humanitarian and relief and development sector is facing right now. Did I cover it? Good. Oh, in our data will take a couple years to show up. Got another one in the back. I think you just have to yell it out. And then what I should be doing is repeating it so the people online know what it is.
So I have a question about So my question about gender inequality is, for the disparity that we see, for instance, in China. I mean, I have some knowledge about the Chinese culture, and I know it's very ingrained, gender inequality in the culture, and along with the other countries as well. So how are you going to combat that? That they make up the core of everything in those countries.
I think you have highlighted the key thing. It's a much deeper cultural component of life, rather than something that can be easily fixed by providing some material assistance or training and so on. So I think that's going to come over dialogue and long-term dialogue, and it's not going to happen overnight. And it will be a constant effort just to education. So just to hark back to one of the key themes of both Pope Leo and Pope Francis is the important role of education.
Right.
But I was looking at another situation where employment in South Africa, where we don't have people trained to take on some of the wonderful jobs that may exist, and that's a generational effort. I think this is even a deeper problem, and it may be a multi-generational effort for people to value the lives of their wives and their daughters and so on.
Thank you so much.
I would just add too, I think like the emphasis on this report and this index is that it's holistic, and these indicators aren't separate from each other, and that ensuring that there's adequate access to education for women and girls will also influence employment rates, and it'll also influence agriculture and food. So these things are connected, and it's about working on each of them on a holistic level, and also working with women and men specifically too on the ground. So trusted messengers and community leaders. So having aid organizations work hand in hand with people who are trusted in the community too.
Just to show you, highlight what you just said about connectedness. Access to water is very much connected to gender, and that's why there's that 30-minute, that you can get the water within 30 minutes and get back to the house. Otherwise, the girls don't get to go to school. They don't get to go to school, then well, problems. Let's take some from online. One is, do you see a significant trend with the relationship between religious freedom and gender equity? Does one affect the other? Don't know the answer. I think we ran a correlation between the two, and it was not significant, right?
I don't think it was.
Yeah, so based on the data we saw, it seems to be two separate problems. But it's certainly in the field of civil liberties, and must be something. And at least in the sense that you brought up that these are deeper cultural issues, not easily addressed. Next one. Given rising population, can we realistically expect these measures to accurately, I speak the Bronx, not English, so reflect the issues, absolute versus relative improvement. So as you saw in some of those graphs, or in all of the graphs, we have the absolute number and we have the relative number. And I think you can see it with, maybe it was employment or something. You can see that one goes ahead of the other and the other lags a little bit. But I think when I was growing up, we had a much higher population rate, and that was a bigger issue. Now we seem to have a declining fertility rate, so it's not as prominent. But you can get something where that's why you have to look at both measures, what's happening absolutely and what's happening relatively, and see if there is a difference between the two. And usually it's a small difference that will, with a little lag, that will go away. Yes.
To add on that, we also would like to highlight that the definitions to these indicators were by Pope Francis. For example, like the gender equity, we're not looking at the number of women in the parliament, for example. We're looking at the healthy lifespan of women versus males. So that's why some of these numbers will not look, or the progress will not look exactly like the other indicators or the other measurements out there.
Yeah, one of the key things in choosing it indicated that it matched what Pope Francis was trying to, was talking about. So did it affect the people at the bottom of society, not the people at top? I think we're out of time, but we'll take the last question.
Why there's a lack of data from North America and on education, housing.
Sure. Anything. The focus of the report is on the developing countries, or the poorer countries. And we could put things in, but then they would have to come from a separate source. So it all depends how, one of the criteria you like to do is have a common source of information on all the data so they're easily comparable. So illiteracy rates is, we get that from UNESCO, I believe, and they only cover the countries that they cover, and they don't cover the rich countries, but we could get the rich countries, and we're pretty sure that they're 99%. So we could put that data, but given our focus, and I guess we're trying to be purists and get it all from a common source, but that has been a criticism of our report. We have especially, we've gotten nuncios from the richer parts of the world saying, how come we're not included here? And so, some people would like to have everything, yeah. And we have a real problem when it comes to housing. That data is very limited. Okay, I think our time is up, and you're. Okay.
Thank you so much to our presenters here. I realized that there were some more questions online as well as in the room. And if it's okay for me to speak for Fordham's iPad students for a moment, those questions can be emailed at the same email you would request the report.
Over lunch.
Or over lunch as well. So thank you for those questions. Thank you for being here to listen. We're running just a few minutes behind for our break. So rather than coming back at 11, you have until 11:05. So if you'd like to take a pastry from the back, some orange juice, or just stretch your legs, maybe speak to the person next to you as well about what you're thinking about this report. And then we will hear our keynote address later on. Thank you very much. You can leave that.
I'm gonna keep it just, it might go out and then have to reboot it.
Thank you, everyone, for being so prompt. I hope everyone got a little snack, some leg room, some stretching of some of your legs, some OJ, some caffeine, and also we're able to converse with one another about what we're seeing in these poverty trends. Our keynote address is from Catholic Relief Services CEO and President, Mr. Sean Callahan, and we're truly blessed to have him with us. Catholic Relief Services, or CRS for short, I keep putting in acronyms to make my job a little bit easier today, will give a keynote address on the realities of the international aid crisis. CRS, which as I mentioned before, is one of 2 US-based members of the Caritas Internationalis Confederation, is the official humanitarian agency of the Catholic community in the United States. CRS puts the gospel into action by supporting humanitarian and development initiatives through partnerships with local faith-based and secular institutions worldwide. Sean joined Catholic Relief Services in 1988, and he has held a wide variety of leadership roles overseas and at the agency's Baltimore, Maryland office. He has an incredible CV, but if I read it all, I'd take up too much time of his keynote. So if you'd like to find it, it's on crs.org. Sean, over to you.
Thank you, Brianne. In 1988, I was an intern in Nicaragua, and I went down to the Mayoreo, which is the market that you go in and buy fresh fruit and things like that. And I used to go around and I used to buy 100 oranges every week, which made me very popular with some of the market ladies, you know, selling 100 oranges right on a go. So they used to kind of debate, who would get to sell them to me. But I met a young boy named Danielle while I was there. And Danielle was a little kid trying to earn a little bit of money for his family and all. And so he wanted to carry my fruit around, you know, and bring it back to the car and all. Well, Danielle, because he, you know, was a little bit malnourished and stuff, couldn't carry the bag of 100 oranges. So I gave him my bananas and a few other things, and I would truck, you know, the oranges back out. But one day I was coming home from work and I was driving down this hill behind the main big hill inside of Managua. And as I was driving down, all of a sudden I noticed that there was a wheelchair, you know, that had fallen over. And then I noticed another wheelchair and a bicycle, and they were all strewn out on the street there where I was going. So I put my car and blocked the way. And then as I saw another guy try to pass me, I knew him from another agency and I said, please stop. And we ended up blocking up all the traffic and went out to see what had happened. And it turns out that these were wheelchair athletes that just got hit by a pickup truck, and they were all left there, you know, just on the road. And so we're trying to help, and I'm, you know, new to Nicaragua. I thought, what the heck do I do? And who appears but Danielle? And he came up and he said, you know, anything I can do. And I said, we need an ambulance. Can you go get an ambulance quick and all? And he said, I'll do my best, you know. So he leaves. 10 minutes later, an ambulance comes, get the people in, and we do everything. And I'm thinking, you know, look, I couldn't have done that, but, you know, Danielle did it, and it was incredible. After that was in the 80s. In the 90s, I was sent to India, and that was at the time we were responding to the HIV/AIDS crisis. And I was in a presentation with this young woman named Pooja. She was giving a presentation to us on HIV and AIDS, and she started out the conversation by saying, I'm blessed to have HIV and AIDS. And I thought, well, that's pretty strange, you know? And she could kind of tell on my face, because after the presentation, she came up to me and she said, you didn't like what I said. And I said, no, I love what you said. I thought it was, you know, really important and all. And she said, but you didn't really like it. And I said, I just don't see how someone could say they were blessed to have HIV and AIDS. And she said,
I was a young woman who was married off by my family to an older man who looked sickly. And he was. And she said, I could have been a young woman who would have just died, out there in the countryside and no one could have known me. But now I'm out here saving lives and I'm telling people my story. And so she said, I couldn't ask for anything more. I could have been a forgotten girl. And now I'm able to change lives. So that kind of stuck with me. And then the next year, 10 years go by and I'm out in Kenya in a Dadaab refugee camp. And people have been coming, into Dadaab, mainly from Somalia because of the war that was happening there. And we go to this little house, and it's sticks with plastic bags that kind of make the shielding of the house. But as I go up to it, I notice that the ground is immaculately swept. It's just really clean. It might be mud ground, but it's very, very clean. And this woman comes out, very vivacious, short woman, and she says, "Hi, I'm Farhiya Muhammad," and she starts, telling me her story that her husband got killed in Somalia by one of the different rebel groups, and she had to migrate to save her son at the time. And it turns out that she was migrating when she was 6 months pregnant. Took her 2 months to walk to Kenya from Somalia as a pregnant woman. And she said there was some blessings on being pregnant because some of the other women were taken by people, but because I was pregnant, I was relatively safe and she got in. And she said, "Please come into my house." And she was so proud. And she said, "I built this myself." And she built this beautiful house. And she said, "When other people now come to the camp, I invite them in to stay with me." So here's a woman who had almost nothing, and she would wash her children's clothes at night so that they would have clean clothes the next day. And she would invite people in to stay with her. And then there's Zara. I was in the 2010s, I was in Afghanistan, out in Chacharan, which is in the middle of the country. And we were doing some education programs for girls. You saw the gender numbers that were up there. And Zara was a little 9-year-old girl. And so we went in, they had a little education program and a little school library and all. And I said, can they read these books? And the teacher, was kind of, puffed up her chest and she said, "Oh, they can." And I looked at this, young girl, Zara, and I said, "Have you read any of the books?" And she pops up and stands up and starts reciting this book, and she's talking about the book and going like 100 miles an hour. And I said, "Could someone translate this?" Because she was very impelled. And it was the story of the jungle. And there were all the animals were out in the jungle and they were trying to figure out, what they would do because it turned out that a fire was coming. And the elephants got together and said, "We have to come together and work against the fire and save our community." And most of the animals said, "No, we're going to just leave. This is too dangerous. We can't do it. Let's all migrate and let's leave." But the elephant said, "No, let's stay." Well, it turned out that all of a sudden, all the other animals are leaving, and the elephants heard, "We will help you." And they're looking around, and they didn't see any, but it was the ants. The ants were going to help the elephants, and they were going to build some tunnels and bring the water to different areas, and the elephants would clear the brush, and then they'd bring the water down, and the ants got working the elephants, and they ended up saving the village, and all. And then Zara, at the end said, "And we're the ants." And I said, "And you're the ants, what does that mean?" And she said, "You are all the elephants. You are the big people out there. But us women out here in Afghanistan, we're the ants." And so that kind of got me a little bit. And then just earlier this month at the United Nations General Assembly, I was invited to an event here, and it was with the Rockefeller Foundation, and the president of Ghana, John Mahama, was here. And they were talking about, at many of the events, people were talking about, wow, things are disastrous. There've been all these cuts, things have gone down. There's no way we're going to be able to serve people. It's just a real downer, the whole thing. But at this event, there wasn't this story about it's a real downer. It's a story about what we're going to do tomorrow. Not to look back at what happened in the rearview mirror, but what we're going to do tomorrow. And so the government of Ghana brought people together and said, this is what we're going to do. If you want to be part of it, join us, but we're not going to sit around and wait for other people to help us. So I just bring those different stories up because as we reflect on the World Day of the Poor, the whole idea on the World Day of the Poor is obviously not to celebrate poverty, right? But it is to make sure that the people that we're talking about are protagonists in the story, that they're the ones making things happen, and it's not us. At Catholic Relief Services, we have a strategy right now, and our strategy goes through 2030. And the name of our strategy is In Their Own Hands, because it's not in our hands. It's in the hands of the people that we're working with. It's in their hands to make the changes happen. And we can help them, but we can't do it for them. And we can't assume that they can't do it for themselves. So we have to make sure that we invest in them and do the right things. So I think that's what we're seeing here with the iPad study is this is a tool that we can use to understand different situations and then to help people. And I think what Pope Francis has told us is we have to remember people and remember that we treat them with human dignity and respect because they can do it. I wouldn't have thought Danielle could have brought the ambulance. I wouldn't have thought Pooja could talk to people internationally. I wouldn't, have guessed that Zada had memorized this story or Fareja was welcoming refugees. But I can imagine the president of Ghana saying, hey, it's time for us to do the job. So is there a crisis with the aid, right now? And, as an organization that got hit pretty hard, we were an organization that kind of grew and grew and grew. And we proved that the church network around the world was a great network to kind of connect and plug into. And Catholic Relief Services, we work in about 120 different countries in the world, plugging into the social service network of the Catholic Church around. So we can do it pretty cost effectively, we can do it pretty efficiently and very professionally. And to prove the point of localization working over the last 7 to 10 years, we have been able to recognize the leadership in the countries in which we've been in. And so the head of our program in our largest country in the world, Ethiopia, is Zemedi Zadue, who's from Ethiopia. And I was just visiting him, and we couldn't ever before. We had a big program in Ethiopia, but now when I go out there, we actually meet with the ministers and the president and other people because Zemedi has made this program part of the program of Ethiopians in Ethiopia and moving it forward. And so we've seen that, but because we did such a good job, we received a lot of grants from the US government, from the Global Fund, from Gavi, which is a global alliance for vaccines and immunizations. And we did pretty well on those. Unfortunately, when you get big cuts, you lose a lot of that. And so when we kind of think, is there an aid crisis? There kind of is, but let's reflect back a little bit about the whole humanitarian assistance and aid and things. And if you go back to the time of World War I. World War I, we had the war that went on, and Wilson ended up forming the League of Nations that was supposed to, stop all wars from happening again. But at the same time, the Treaty of Versailles was a punitive treaty in which the Germans didn't feel respected, or that their dignity was there, or that people, were somewhat making very harsh calls upon them, which embarrassed them, which ended up resulting in World War II. And so we learned some lessons at that time in World War II. And then World War II came to, as it was going through, and many organizations like our own were formed at that time. Many faith-based organizations, CRS was formed in 1943, because there was a determination that it probably wasn't good for those who were creating the violence and the war to also be those that were helping. So a lot of faith-based groups came together, and then they actually formed other groups like CARE and others, the Cooperatives for America, for Relief Everywhere, and others. The faith-based groups thought it would be good to have some secular groups as well, because maybe people would feel uncomfortable with the faith groups. So they all got together, and started working. And then the evolution continued. We had the Cold War, and we had the Russian side and the American side and things, and you were pulling one country and another, and we were still trying to do it. And we came up with neutrality, with independence, with respect for others, that the way we do development changed, and that we would have standards on how we would do those. And so we started to move forward. So you can see there's been this evolution from the very beginning of how we do economic and development assistance, and where we need to go into the future. And as we were doing it at those times, we faced different challenges, and as you all know, we faced different disasters in different places, different political violence and the wars that have gone on, whether they're in Africa, Latin America, now even in Europe with Ukraine. And so we were trying to balance all of these different entities that were going on, and work together with various consortiums and others. And so if you were to say, is there a crisis? I would say, as we came into this year, we still had, as you saw with the statistics, about 800 million people living in poverty. So 10% of the world population living in poverty. I would say that we probably haven't been successful in the international economic development world on helping people to the appropriate level. We saw that 700 million people don't have adequate food. Over 700 million people are illiterate and don't have activities. We didn't mention it there, but 117 million people are forcibly displaced from their homes and have been pushed out, and many from the countries you would imagine when you look at Ethiopia, you look at Syria, you look at Ukraine. People have been forced out. It's not that they wanted to necessarily leave, it's they couldn't stay at home. And there's some wonderful poems and things when you talk to people, that people only leave home when they feel they're in the mouth of a shark, and they can't do anything else. So when we think about the international is aid in crisis, my comment is, yeah, we've been in crisis for a long time. We really have. Now, some people see that crisis, well, maybe you're not being as efficient. And we develop this little more of a nihilistic way of addressing things. And we say, well, let's get rid of it all. And that's what we ended up doing as a country with USAID. And quite frankly, in Europe, it's happened as well. You look at the British who have, decreased a lot of their assistance, the Germans and others. And so internationally, we had this big cataclysm of what was going on. And so people kind of thought, well, if it's not working, let's just get rid of it, without thinking of how do we transition. And so we as a country, started using what I would say is disinformation, to be kind, on waste, fraud, and abuse, that everything was waste, fraud, and abuse, and all these different things you see overseas that are terrible must have come out of USAID and other things. Well, to be frank, anyone who has ever received US government funding knows of the strictures that you have, and actually you know, at Catholic Relief Services, we have what's called an A133 audit for the US government. We have an Ernst & Young audit for the Global Fund. We have an audit in each of the countries in which we work for those governments that we pass by. So, you know, this kind of disinformation that the assistance is being misused was incorrect. But I don't think we did a good job of telling the story on how we could help and move people forward. And I don't think we did a good enough job of taking risks to show how we would do things differently. We built over this time, the Global Fund came to be. Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccines. The Global Fund does HIV, AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. And we did the PEPFAR initiative. Some of you have heard. It's the President's Emergency Program for AIDS Relief. So we did these wonderful programs, but we kept developing new programs without refining the infrastructure underneath them. And some of these programs were terrific and doing great jobs and saving lives, but we didn't take the time to kind of restructure and relook. And so was the way the US government, the way they went about doing the structure of the US aid, the right way of doing it? I think absolutely not. And quite frankly, when I meet with senators and Congress people and everything, and they say, yeah, you know, we had some people in and they, you know, use Chat GPT to say, oh, it's got environment, cut that out, or it's got a women's program, cut that out. You know, it doesn't make sense as you go through. And so I was, you know, going through and talking to them, and I was with a Republican senator, and he said, wow, I wouldn't think you guys would be considered a woke organization. And I said, you know, rightly or wrongly, Senator, we probably wouldn't be considered a woke organization. And he said, but do you do some of that, you know, that environment stuff or that DEI stuff and everything? And I said, it depends how you define environment and DEI. And he said, well, give me an example. And I brought up the example of Afghanistan. I said, you know, in Afghanistan, we do this girls' education, not because we don't want to give boys the education. Boys can go to school, but we wanted to give girls the opportunity to go to school and see what they do. And I said, we have this program outside of Herat, and this young woman comes out and teaches women in this different area. And now the women can be more productive citizens, their families are healthier, and things, you know, work out much better for them. And he said, well, that makes good sense. And I said, yeah. And he said, well, how about that environmental stuff? And I said, well, you know that in the, you know, natural disasters, that about 60% of natural disasters hit Asia. And about 60% of those actually hit the Philippines, archipelago. And you know, the Philippines gets hit really hard. Well, we have a big environmental program in the Philippines to help them prepare and prevent and mitigate natural disasters when they come and hit, how to protect their livelihoods, how to protect their homes, how to work with the community, how to save the environment. Well, that makes good sense, you know, is his response. And I'm going, well, that's DEI and that's the environment. And that's what we just cut. And so again, we weren't really thinking of where we were going and what we were doing on how we would do these things. So is aid in a crisis? I'd say yes, but it's not the crisis you think. There is the crisis of the funding, and that's a problem. And we have to figure out how to address it. But we don't just address it by saying, give us all the money back, because quite frankly, it's not coming back, at least not in the short term. So what did we start doing? Well, we did some things that we didn't want to have to do. We had to reduce a lot of our staff around the world. We had to consolidate our programs. We had to make ourselves even more efficient than we were before. Unfortunately, our local partners also got hit because, you know, when the US made its cuts, it also stopped funding a lot of initiatives like Ukraine and other things that were keeping the Europeans a little more comfortable. So the Europeans started funding now Ukraine, and they stopped funding Africa and Asia and Latin America, and they cut as well. So when we see ourselves being cut 40, 50%, we see our local partners on the ground being cut 40, 50% as well. And so cutting back those programs. And can you imagine when you receive a stop work order and you have HIV/AIDS drugs for a child and you can't give them out, or you have food in a warehouse and you're told you can't give the food out to these people because you have a stop work order, or kids come in for their polio vaccine and they say, sorry, no vaccines today. But it's on the shelf. And people were told they couldn't give them out because we had stopped work orders. So did that make the US look safer, stronger, and more prosperous? Kind of made us look a little bad and a little petty. And to the degree that we had a shipment of food on the high seas that landed in Cameroon, and we were trucking it from Cameroon to Chad to get it into the Darfur, where people were starving and famine was declared. And when we were doing this, they wouldn't allow the ship to dock unless I indemnified the ship in Cameroon, because they didn't trust that the US government would pay its bills if any charges were incurred. So here's supposedly, the greatest country in the world, and we failed, to even be able to, have ships land in different countries as we move forward. So what do we start doing besides kind of our different addressing the immediate, shocks of it and trying to put ourselves in a little better position? We started looking out for other initiatives that we could do. And so started thinking, how do we do development differently? Even more so, we had always been a partnership agency. I don't like to call Catholic Relief Service a humanitarian assistance and development agency, because we're really a relationship agency. And what that means is we make relationships with local people on the ground and see what they need, and then co-develop programs with them so that they can be sustainable and they can make sure that they work into the future. So if we do an education program, it's passing it over so that the local community, the local government, local people participate and can take that over after we leave. So we provide a semi-seed, or a mustard seed of assistance, and then the local people make that grow. A great example is Jordan, for instance, with the Syrian war and the Iraq war and everything. Jordan got a flood of different refugees coming in, and there's a group called Caritas that's international. They're kind of like Catholic Charities in the United States, but this was in Jordan, mainly a Sunni Muslim country. And Caritas Jordan had about 8 or 12 people that were part of Caritas Jordan at the time. Really wonderful, dynamic people. And CRS went there, they said, can you come? And we set up an office and we worked with them. And now CRS has one person in the office of Caritas Jordan, and Caritas Jordan has 189 different staff members that are doing things around the country, helping. Even though it's a big minority in the country, they're now servicing a lot of the refugees, providing assistance, and serving as a gateway for supply chain into Gaza and different areas of the Holy Land, and working together. And so this is the type of activity where you provide it. Interestingly enough, because of the volatility in the region, Caritas Jordan just asked us to reopen an office with them there, because they'd like to have an international footprint as well, because they're a little afraid if something were to happen to the present government there, they wanted a little more protection. So there are roles that we can play together. Another example of doing things, so the US government, kind of bizarrely cut all assistance to Central America. Now, I was in Honduras at the time when it got cut, and they said, I thought you didn't want people to be migrating from Latin America up. Why would you cut the aid that helps people be able to stay here? And I said, it does sound, seem a little counterintuitive, doesn't it? And so, because one of the gentlemen was saying, I was one step before I was going to go north, but a water smart agriculture program in the dry corridor helped me do some things there that I couldn't have done before. And now I can provide education for my kids and healthcare and everything. So I'm staying. But if you cut these programs that link us to markets and help us do things, then what do we have? What option do we have but to go someplace else and fight for our families? And so this is the struggle we go through. But an example of some ingenuity that happened was in El Salvador, we were looking at what to do. And it turned out that JP Morgan Chase ended up buying $1 billion worth of Salvadorian debt. And in buying that $1 billion of the debt, they ended up lowering the payments on interest that Salvador would have to pay by $350 million. And so part of the deal with JP Morgan Chase and then the Development Finance Corp of the US government was that the Salvadorian government would have to use 200 million of that to help small farmers and protect the agriculture in the Rio Lempa watershed. So they'd use $200 million that would be reserved for the next 20 years, that they could use $10 million a year to invest in the watershed and help it move forward. And they said, we need somebody, to manage this. And they didn't want it to be the government because they were a little worried. Is that going to be, is it going to go for elections or against certain people and others? And so they asked the government who they'd recommend. They asked local people who they recommend. And they said, I think the church can do it. And CRS has the people and stuff. And so they asked us to take it over. Now, my team on the ground, who happens to be a lot smarter than me, said, no, we're not going to accept it. And I thought, what are they doing? Not going to accept it? Are you kidding me? But they said they wanted to make sure the government had something in it, because if the government wasn't involved in the program, it might put up impediments to making it succeed. So ended up making a parastatal, working together with the government. We are now the technical lead on the program and moving that forward. In Malawi and Uganda, we've got some funding from investors in HSBC, which is the Hong Kong bank, that's investing in the environment in those countries. And we're planting 21 million trees in those two countries to lower the carbon burden of some companies, but to help these countries do agricultural development in the short term so that people can work and move forward. In Mexico, there's a social development bond that the government is asking us to now work there to do some of the services that the government can't do right now. So just to suffice it to say that we're not all sitting around waiting for the US government to all of a sudden go, oh, we made a mistake and we're going to give you $60 billion yet to move this forward. We have to go back out and figure out what can we do better and smarter and how we can work and move things forward. So what does that mean? It means we have to reestablish the credibility of the sector in general, to be honest with you. So some of the sector has lost some of its credibility because of this whole waste, fraud, and abuse type thing. And so we're out there telling people what we're doing. We're not complaining about what happened in the past, but we're saying, if you're people of hope and you want to do things, this is the way you can do it. And if you invest in us, it's going to be the best way to move this forward. We're also, making sure that all of our operations and other things are less duplicative, that we're working better. We're making sure that local people are in leadership positions and that they can kind of take this forward and help us, move this as we go on into the future. So we are investing in making sure that we're in the right position to make this happen. The other thing that's crucial, and for those of you who are in this field of study and see, is this where I really should be, is now is the time that we need really, really talented individuals who can help us move this agenda forward, who aren't mired in yesterday's way of doing things, but who are ready to help us provide technical assistance to people in punctual ways, and then look at ways that we can do innovative investing or new ways of addressing things. The world still is, really frightened about Ebola and COVIDs and Mpox and, things like that. And so there's going to be some need, but we have to be smart on how we do it. And we have to make sure that we are the ones that are leading the charge and that they're funding us. We're not just taking funding from them. I'll stop there and then open it up if anyone has any questions. Usually I try to talk long enough so that there isn't time for questions. Here she comes.
Could you talk about some career opportunities for people who are available?
Sure. As you might imagine, right this very moment is probably one of the most challenging times to apply for jobs in different places, just because many organizations have just reduced their staffs in many areas. But at Catholic Relief Services, that same thing has happened to us, and we have lost a good number of staff. At the same time, we're recompeting all of our new positions because we may not have the people that have the skills for tomorrow today. And so if you have some type of skill, have some type of experience, are game to go into different areas, that would be the way to go. I'd also say that probably early on at this time, looking at difficult countries to go to, emergency programs is probably the best career advice I could give you. There's a ton of people down in Washington that are sitting around looking for jobs, but not as many with the technical assistance to provide assistance to Ukraine or Sudan or Ethiopia or Haiti. So I would say you have some languages, you have the ability to work with and have a mentality for working with local people to assist them in moving things forward, and go to programs where you don't see them as being easy for people. And depending on your personal situation, I know when I first got out, I went to Nicaragua at that time, and it was more of an emergency post. A lot of people with families didn't go because there was the Iran-Contra, war going on and things like that. I had actually fantastic time, learned a real lot, but people with families weren't going to be staying in those situations. So I had a leg up on them, going in.
We have a question from online, and that is, do you think changing public attitudes on foreign aid are linked to the rise of a kind of zero-sum politics domestically? That is, have things like wealth inequality and erosion of opportunities for the working class in the West prompted so much of the political backlash to aid?
It's kind of interesting when we do this survey. Did everyone hear the question? Could you hear that? Is the change in the idea about aid? It's interesting when you look at all the surveys, people actually don't have a problem with assisting others in other countries. It's in general, it's over 60% that say, yeah, we're in favor of it. What they want to make sure is that we're doing it the right way, that we're doing it efficiently, and that we're not wasting resources. And so that's the trick we have to get out there. We can't tell them that, just let us do it in the same old way, and tomorrow we're going to change things. We have to show people we're changing things now, we're doing things efficient and better, and we're helping people and be able to prove it. So for us, it's very important. We have people that we call our meal team, which is monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning. We need to be accountable for everything we do. We need to be able to show it and prove it and show the outcomes that we can, that investments breed. And so that's something that we're doing more and more. So bottom line, I think the biggest problem that we have probably is communications. There's a lot of noise out there in social media, and a lot of it's just not true. I had a donor who called me up one day, happens to be the head of a foundation, and he said, and I pick up the phone and I say hello, and he says, "What do they think? I'm stupid?" And I'm going, "Excuse me?" And he said, "Do they really think I'm that stupid?" And I'm going, "Help me out here. Where are you going with this?" And it happened that someone in the administration had stated that 12% of the resources that the US government gives goes to the people overseas. And he was, the head of this foundation was saying, do they really think we're stupid that we would only, we'd give out all this money and only 12% would get to the people on the ground? What ended up happening is that 12% came from the previous administration had a plan to provide 25% of the resources they were giving directly to local entities. So not through Catholic Relief Services, although if they give it through us, 95, 94, 96% goes to the local people. They weren't counting that went. They were just saying, well, 12% was going directly, and they ended up creating a disinformation stream that said that only 12% goes there. So fortunately, I explained it to this guy, gave him all the numbers, and he said, great. He was from Florida. He was going to call the Secretary of State right away and let him know what he thought about his statements. But again, I think we have to be much better at telling people how their resources are used, what's the impact of that, and why it's important, not only for those people, but for us into the future.
For your talk, I'm curious your thoughts on why the narrative waste and abuse is popular, and if you think there are any types of
Good question. I think I couldn't say any particular types of aid that might be inefficient and wasteful as a broad category. I am sure that some organizations or some ways of doing things in any field, there's always problems in different areas. So I'm sure there are some of the things that could have been done better. There certainly could have been greater collaboration in many areas. I think what people fail to realize from administration to administration is there's a big evolution in the way development has been done. When we first started, we were, handing out food in different places. Now, we're giving seeds to people, we're planting, we're looking at gender and water, and we're looking at a more integral human development type way of doing things. And so I think that's, much more positive. I think part of the issue of waste, fraud, and abuse is it's cultural in the United States. Americans in general, we don't like being ripped off. We like a good deal, and we like to be seen as we did the best job. When I go hunting for a car, I got the best price. If I find out someone else got a price, I don't tell them how much I paid because I feel bad about it. So I think that type of narrative grabbed onto people, and then there was a lot of disinformation that said these things are happening. Many of those things that they said actually were not even funded by USAID. They were funded by an ambassador's fund in a mission, and they funded a one-off on something that the current administration didn't like and things. But I do think that probably in the past things that we have not done correctly is not integrating our development efforts more with the local people, the local government, and how that's done, and setting up parallel systems. So I think more and more people are seeing now that's not the way to go forward and do it. And we need to make sure that we integrate the systems together if they're going to be sustainable for the longer term. So I would say a separate entity that comes in and does things completely different isn't there. And quite frankly, some of these new mechanisms, like the Global Fund, for instance, we happen to be a big partner with the Global Fund. They give their resources to the local government. The local government then, if they can't fulfill the obligations, will have a technical organization do some of it. So the local government is in charge. If the local government has some credibility issues, the Global Fund may give it to an organization like us, but we then work with the local government. And the idea is we're going to pass it over to the local government on the next phase or the next round. So I think integrating in a sustainable way with either local civil society entities or local governments, is a more successful approach than we probably had in the past.
time for one more question?
So other than obviously just giving, how do you integrate being a Catholic organization and those values into what you do?
So, you know, our strategy as a Catholic agency, if you were to check it out on our website, it has human dignity on the center, care for creation. We go down subsidiarity, solidarity, you know, follow all of those. We happen to have a board committee that's a Catholic identity committee on ours. And we are 100% Catholic as an agency, but not all of our team are Catholic. Quite frankly, in Afghanistan, the majority of our team are Muslims, but they believe in the mission of the agency. And so our philosophy is we do things because we're Catholic, not because the people we serve are Catholic or the people we work with are Catholic. And you'd be amazed at how some of our staff can articulate this, you know, that are Muslim much better than some of my Catholic colleagues can articulate it as we go forward. The blessing that we do have is part of this network of Caritas International. You know, they work in over 160 different countries in the world. We can plug right in with them and with the Catholic Church. So as an organization, we are invited into the country by the local Catholic Church. So if the local church says, we don't need you, we don't come in. So I can even give you an example. When Ukraine hit, we were talking to our Ukrainian partners and we said, you know, it's probably time to start thinking. We're afraid that this could blow up into something. You lost Crimea last time. And they said, this couldn't happen again, won't happen to us or everything. We said, well, let's pre-position some things. So we pre-positioned some things, got it going. Anyway, we ended up working with them. And then all of a sudden February hit and Russia entered and they were going, oh my God, what's going on here? We had a team that was there. We right away did a grant, US government supported. We gave it out to our local Caritas partner. They were responding, doing a fantastic job. And then they said, you know, for the next grant, we'd like to be the lead of it. And we said, go right ahead, you know. So we talked to them, we set it up, we helped them design the grant. They just didn't know how the US government exactly wanted things, worked together with it. Now they're leading the effort and we're supporting them. So we plug right into the local Catholic Church in the different areas, make sure we're consonant with them. And when the reason why the senator would say you're not a woke organization is we do have to follow and do follow all of the policies of the Catholic Church, either the US Catholic Church's policies or the policies of the local church where we work, or whichever is more conservative. Because we don't want to get in any problems with any local church or the US church on any of these issues.
Thank you very much, Sean. That was helpful. I think when entering the room today, coming from a world of social media and news outlets, it was far too easy to feel hopeless or even angry about world events and quite questionable about what we would hear today. But I sense optimism and a real potential for advocacy here, especially with our young students, that is needed at such a time as this. But you might be asking, what is it we can do right here, right now, if we're still finishing our degree, not going into the field right away, or not going across the street into the UN after this? Here to tell us about a simple step you can take today, because there is one, is Jess Morell. Many of you know Jess, but for those of you who do not, Jess is the volunteer manager of educational institutions at CRS and a wonderful colleague.
Thank you so much, Brianna. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Dr. S. All the iPad students, amazing, inspiring. So happy to be here. I want to first thank all of you. Thank you for saying yes. Thank you for coming. Special shout out to all our university chapter members that are here. It's so great to be able to see all those Zoom calls with you. It's so awesome to be here with you in person. So thank you for saying yes. I'm going to take a brief moment and I'm going to ask everyone here to do a little bit of a reflection. I want you to think about your why. Why do you care? Why do you care about our global family? Why are you here? Why do you want to learn more? Why are you studying this? So I'm just asking you all to take 30 seconds just think to yourself, why do I care about this? Okay, and while I do continue or encourage you to continue thinking about that, as Brianna said, you know, what can we do, right? Sometimes it can feel so frustrating. Well, there's a lot you can do, and you've made your first yes today. You're here, you're learning, right? You can share, you can learn, educate others. So many, I'm looking at chapters, board members here today, you all donate, you fundraise, you really make a difference. But something we can do right now, something that's simple, is we can use our voices to advocate. Now I know, Sean spoke about, the money and working with the government and finding new ways to do things, but we still want the government to know we care, right? So I'm going to encourage you and I challenge you to think about that why. And hopefully, if you feel so motivated, to pull out those cell phones and you can scan the QR code here, or if you're having any trouble with that, it is a pretty simple link to type in. And I believe for the live stream, we're going to put the link in the chat so you can just click on it. And I encourage you to take a look at this form. CRS makes it super easy for you. We have a form laid out. When you put your name and your zip code in there, this is going to go to both of your senators and your representative associated with the zip code you choose. So feel free to use your home or your university zip code if you're one of the students here today. But the big thing is I really want you to think about that why. And in the spot where we encourage you to share, I want you to put that why. Why do you care? Why is this important? Sean mentioned we're just supporting. It's the people that we're working with, the partners in the countries we're going to that are making the difference. But you can help, you can support that. Use your voice. So I'm going to give you a moment to give that a look. It is updated since the government shut down. You can feel free to read. Since that reopened, we have an awesome staff that have updated that link for us up to the moment. So I just encourage you to do this. And this is something you can share, these links, these QR codes. You can share them on your campus. I know we have awesome schools, University of St. Thomas, Minnesota. You put it on your Instagram, you put it on your boards on campus. You can share this out. I really encourage you to use your voice and let people know that this matters to you. Remember your why. And thank you so much for saying yes. I know I'm the last thing between you and lunch. So just give you another moment or so to fill that out. But I do want to say thank you again so much before I turn it over to Brianna. And thank you again, Sean, Dr. S, for sharing, and all the students for everything. So Brianna, I'm going to turn it back to you, and thanks for participating, everyone.
Okay, so we're gonna leave this up here for a moment so you can feel free to take your phones out, scan that QR code, put in the link that you see there, and also send it to your friends, as Jess said, send it out to your campus social medias, your chapter social medias, etc. So thank you, Dr. S, for Fordham, iPad students who have put this all together. Every year there seems to be more technology. There's lights this year that I get to be under. I feel like a superstar up here. Thank you to Sean Callahan for being here and representing CRS, as well as the colleagues at CRS who put this together with me and with Dr. S and Donna, Jess, and also Claire, who some of you might know as well. If you are a CRS University student, your lunch is on the 11th floor. I know it's a bit confusing. And if you are not a chapter student, your lunch is right behind us here. For chapter students, we'll see you back here at 1 p.m. for your career panel. If that made no sense to you, your lunch is probably in this room. So thank you all again for being here, and enjoy your lunch and conversation.